On the morning of May 11th, 1894, 6-year-old Nellie Meeks appeared at the farmhouse of John and Sarah Carter in Lynn County, Missouri. She was barefoot, her clothes torn, her face smeared with dirt and dried blood. A deep gash cut across her forehead. Mrs. Carter was startled by the child's condition and tried to understand her halting words. Nellie told her that her father, mother, and little sisters had been killed during the night and were buried in a straw stack out in a nearby field. The Carters, frightened and unsure, sent their 10-year-old son to check the haystack on a neighboring farm. That moment marked the beginning of what would become known as the Meeks family murder case, with Nellie as the sole surviving witness. The Meeks family had been living near Browning, in Lynn County. The father, Greenberry Gus Meeks, was about 33 years old. His wife, Delora, was around 30. They had 3 daughters, Nellie, the eldest, and 2 younger girls, Hattie, about 4, and Mary, about 18 months old. The family had ties to William P. Bill Taylor and his brother, George Taylor, prominent local men who operated a bank and owned farmland in the area. By 1894, the Taylors were facing serious trouble. They were suspected of cattle rustling, forgery, and other frauds, and Gus Meeks had agreed to testify against them in a cattle theft case. This made him a key witness and placed the Meeks family directly in the path of the Taylors' attempt to protect themselves. On the night of May 10th, 1894, the Meeks family packed quickly to leave their home near Milan, Missouri. According to later accounts, the Taylors had arranged to take them by wagon, promising to move them to a new place. Gus, Delora, and their 3 girls climbed into the wagon with Bill and George Taylor. They set off into the darkness along the road that passed near Jenkins Cemetery, about a mile from Browning. During the subsequent inquest and later retellings, Nellie described that trip in specific detail. She recalled that as they went up the hill by the cemetery, the man without whiskers, identified as George Taylor, complained that his feet were cold, got down from the wagon, and walked alongside it. As the wagon moved slowly up Jenkins Hill, the attack began. Nellie later testified that George, walking beside the wagon, suddenly shot her father. Gus attempted to jump from the vehicle and run, but he collapsed after being hit. Delora screamed and tried to get out with the children. Shots followed. Gus and Delora were both shot, and one of the little girls was hit. The younger children were then beaten with a rock. Nellie herself was struck on the head and lost consciousness. The assailants believed she was dead. The victims' bodies were loaded into the wagon and taken onto George Taylor's farm, to a cornfield where an old straw stack stood. There, in the middle of the night, the man and woman and the 2 smaller children were buried in a shallow grave under the edge of the straw. Nellie was thrown in with them. Sometime before dawn, Nellie regained consciousness beneath the straw. Head injured and disoriented, she managed to wriggle free from the shallow grave and crawl out from under the stack. In the dim light, she could see nearby farmhouses. At first, she started toward the Taylor place, but then turned and went instead to the closer Carter home. Mud clung to her clothes, straw stuck to her hair, and blood from the wound on her forehead had dried down her face. At the Carters' door, she announced her name and told Sarah Carter that her parents and sisters were dead and buried in the haystack. The Carters, fearful and unsure what to believe, sent their young son Jimmy to the stack to see if anything was there. Jimmy went out across the wet field, passing George Taylor, who was out with a team in Harrow. Taylor was working the ground around the straw stack, apparently to erase wagon tracks. When the boy mentioned that there were dead people in the haystack, Taylor told him to wait and said they would go together after he finished with the team, but he went back to his house instead. Jimmy continued to the stack on his own, but, from the surface, saw nothing. When he returned, Nellie insisted she could show him. She led him back and pulled away the straw until the faces of her parents were visible. Horrified, the boy returned to his mother, and the Carters alerted neighbors and authorities. The sheriff and local citizens soon arrived at the Taylor farm. Together, they began pulling straw off the stack and digging in the damp ground. One by one, they uncovered the bodies. First one of the small children, her head crushed. Then Gus, shot through the head. Delora, with multiple bullet wounds in her back. And the baby, her skull shattered. They also recovered a pistol with several empty chambers and a blood-stained rock believed to have been used to kill the younger girls. Investigators quickly noted that the grave lay on George Taylor's land and that Taylor had been seen harrowing near the straw stack that morning, with Nellie's account pointing directly to the man without whiskers and another man with him. Suspicion focused squarely on George and William Taylor. While Nellie was examined by a doctor for her head wound, she repeated her story to law officers. She explained how the Taylors had come in the wagon, how they had driven up the hill by Jenkins Cemetery, how one brother got down and started shooting, and how she had been struck and went to sleep. At the coroner's inquest, her testimony was recorded, naming Bill and George Taylor as the men who had taken the family from their home and attacked them on the road. Based on her statement and the physical evidence at the straw stack, indictments were issued for William P. Taylor and George E. Taylor for the murder of the Meeks family. By the time the bodies were recovered and the warrants issued, the Taylor brothers had fled. Their disappearance set off a highly publicized manhunt. For weeks, newspapers in Missouri and beyond carried stories about the bodies in the haystack, murders, and the search for the Taylor brothers, described as leaders of a large-scale rustling ring. In late June 1894, the fugitives were located near Buffalo City, Arkansas, and captured by a lawman named Jerry South. They were brought back to Carroll County, Missouri, for trial. Public anger was intense. Lynching threats followed the transfer, and crowds gathered at various stops along the return route, forcing authorities to maintain tight security around the prisoners. The first trial, held in 1895, ended with a hung jury. A retrial was ordered. In the second proceeding, the state focused on the murder of Gus Meeks, specifically, using Nellie's eyewitness account, the location of the grave on George Taylor's land, the recovered weapon, and the Taylors' motive to silence Gus as a witness against them in cattle rustling and fraud cases. The jury found both William and George Taylor guilty of first-degree murder, and the court sentenced them to hang. They were confined in the Carrollton jail, while a gallows was constructed in the yard. On the night of April 11th, 1896, they escaped along with another prisoner by cutting through the ceiling of their cell and getting onto the roof. William Taylor was recaptured within weeks. He was hanged on April 30th, 1896, before a large crowd. George Taylor successfully disappeared and was not brought back to Missouri. Decades later, a man who died of natural causes in a remote cabin in the Cookson Hills of Oklahoma was identified as George Taylor, ending the question of what became of him. In the years after the murders, Nellie lived with relatives. According to family and local histories, she stayed with her grandmother Paige until her mid-teens. At around 16, she married a man named Albert Spray. Nellie died young, in 1905, at about 18 years of age, shortly after the birth of a child, and was buried under the name Nellie L. Spray. During the decade following the crime, her story was retold in newspapers, pamphlets, and even ballads describing the Meeks murder. Some accounts claim she sometimes recounted the events in public settings, while others from her family denied that she ever traveled in carnivals or exhibitions. What is certain from court records and contemporary reports is that the case against the Taylor brothers depended heavily on her early morning journey from the straw stack to the Carter farmhouse, and on the detailed account she provided at the inquest. Through that testimony, the killings of her parents and sisters were brought to light, and the men responsible were formally named and tried. On July 31st, 1960, a group of people exploring a remote area of the Arizona desert in Yavapai County discovered the partially buried remains of a young girl. The location was near Congress, Arizona, miles from any home, road, or sign of recent activity. At first glance, the investigators could tell the child was very young. She wore a white blouse, white shorts, and pink sandals. There were no identifying items in or near the grave. The child's fingerprints could not be taken, and no one had reported a missing girl in the immediate region. The Yavapai County Sheriff's Office initiated a homicide investigation. The child was given the temporary name Little Miss Nobody, and over time the case would become one of the most widely known unidentified child cases in the western United States. Investigators estimated the girl to be between 3 and 6 years old. An examination suggested she had been dead for at least 1 to 2 weeks, The cause of death was difficult to determine due to decomposition, but the medical examiner believed she had likely been deceased for some time before her body was left in the desert. The condition of her clothing, particularly the clean white sandals, indicated she had not walked into the area herself. Someone had brought her there. With no immediate leads, detectives contacted agencies across Arizona and neighboring states. Flyers were printed with a composite drawing, hoping someone would recognize her face. Newspapers called her Little Miss Nobody because authorities had no name to give the child and no idea where she had come from. At the same time, 600 miles away in Alamogordo, New Mexico, a separate investigation was underway. On July 21st, 1960, 10 days before the body was found in Arizona, 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gallegos had disappeared from an alley behind her family's home. Sharon had been born on September 6, 1956. She lived with her mother and brothers in a modest neighborhood. She was described as outgoing, affectionate, and protective of her younger siblings. During the days leading up to her abduction, family members noticed a strange woman and man repeatedly watching Sharon from a green car. The woman had approached Sharon more than once, telling her she wanted to buy her clothes and asking neighbors about the little girl. On the afternoon of July 21st, while Sharon was playing behind her house, a car drove into the alley. Witnesses reported a woman grabbing Sharon and pulling her into the vehicle. The car sped away before anyone nearby could intervene. Despite immediate searches and alerts issued by local authorities, no trace of Sharon was found in the area. When the unidentified remains were discovered in Arizona, investigators briefly considered a connection. They contacted authorities in New Mexico, but early comparisons created confusion. Sharon was reported to be 4 years old. The Arizona girl was estimated to be older, possibly 6. Arizona examiners initially believed the remains were older than 10 days, which would make the timeline inconsistent with Sharon's disappearance. Additionally, Sharon was reported to have worn different clothing at the time she was taken. Based on these details, investigators hesitated to link the cases. Over time, the two investigations drifted apart. Sharon remained missing, and the Arizona child remained unidentified. In the following decades, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office periodically re-examined the Little Miss Nobody case. Composite drawings were updated, records digitized, and the case was entered into national databases of unidentified victims. In 1960, the community of Prescott held a funeral for the child. Local businesses donated a dress, casket, and cemetery plot. Hundreds of residents attended. The marker on her grave read, Little Miss Nobody, the 23rd of March, 1957 to the 31st of July, 1960. Blessed are the pure in heart. The dates were estimates based on the medical examiner's findings. The community's involvement ensured she would not be forgotten, even though her true name remained unknown. In the 1992s and 2000s, as forensic technology advanced, investigators revisited the case repeatedly. DNA was first attempted in the early 2000s, but the degraded condition of the remains made extraction difficult. Over the years, specialists continued trying to isolate a viable sample. Meanwhile, the Gallegos family in New Mexico never stopped wondering what had happened to Sharon. Although there had been early suspicions that she might have been the Arizona child, the initial dismissal caused the two investigations to remain separate for decades. Sharon's family continued searching, keeping her photograph, missing person reports, and news clippings preserved across generations. In 2018, modern forensic efforts were again attempted on the remains of Little Miss Nobody. A small bone sample was sent to a laboratory specializing in degraded DNA. Over several years, the sequencing process was improved through repeated testing. In January 2022, a viable DNA profile was finally generated. With new capabilities in forensic genetic genealogy, investigators partnered with a private laboratory to build a family tree from the unidentified child's DNA. Matches soon appeared, linking the child to relatives of Sharon Lee Gallegos in New Mexico. Detectives contacted the Gallegos family to compare family history, missing person details, and genealogical information. The match strengthened until it became conclusive. On March 15, 2022, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office publicly confirmed that Little Miss Nobody was, in fact, 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gallegos. The identification ended 62 years of uncertainty. Investigators stated that the new DNA evidence, combined with genealogical mapping and timeline reconciliation, resolved all remaining inconsistencies. Although the initial age estimate in 1960 had been inaccurate, the physical characteristics, clothing, and DNA connections confirmed the match. The Gallegos family finally received an answer to a question that had remained open for more than 6 decades. Sharon's relatives expressed gratitude that she had at last been identified and could be connected to her family name. With the identification finally made, investigators re-examined the known circumstances of Sharon's abduction. Witnesses from 1,960 had described a woman and a man who appeared to have watched Sharon for days before taking her. They were described as possibly in their 30s, driving a green sedan, with the woman repeatedly asking about Sharon's clothing and attempting to interact with her. Though the suspects were never identified, authorities believed the abductors traveled west from New Mexico into Arizona. The remote burial site near Congress suggested the perpetrators were attempting to abandon the body far from the abduction location. With more than 6 decades having passed, investigators stated that those responsible were likely deceased. No arrests were ever made in connection with Sharon's abduction or death. The Yavapai County Sheriff's Office noted that identifying Sharon did not close the case but brought clarity to a central question that had defined it for years. They acknowledged the role of the local community that had cared for Sharon in 1960 without knowing her name, as well as the significance of modern DNA technology in resolving the identity of long unidentified victims. Sharon was reconnected with her family through the official acknowledgement of her name, ending the chapter of her life in which she had been known only as Little Miss Nobody. The Gallegos family expressed that although they could not change the events of 1,960, knowing what happened to Sharon allowed them to finally bring her story to rest. Investigators confirmed that Sharon's remains would continue to be honored where she had been laid to rest decades earlier. The case, once divided between 2 states and 2 narratives, finally reached the conclusion that had eluded investigators for 62 years.